Good evening. You may be surprised by the panelist. I am too. All of you here have noticed that it snowed today. Having guests not be able to get to Boston because of the snow was something we did not expect on April 10th, obviously. And for the sake of the panelists' reputations who are not here, let me just tell you some of the things that happened. First of all, Madeline Cunin had to cancel 2 days ago because of a death in her family. We had someone coming up from the Heritage Foundation who had agreed to come on very short notice, and unfortunately he was not able to get on a plane out of Washington this afternoon that would have gotten him here before 7 o'clock. Elaine Chao actually did get on a plane in Washington this afternoon, and she's still on a plane. She may be off now, but she has to turn right around and go back to Washington in order to make sure that she gets back tonight, unfortunately. So she has not had a pleasant experience, I know. But Michael Lipsky, who just arrived from New York, Kevin Moriarty, who came the farthest way and understands how hard it is to get from San Antonio to Boston, so he arrived yesterday, and Ruth Mccambridge, who is the true saint of the evening, just agreed 5 minutes ago to be part of the panel. And I guarantee it that, I mean, she's speaking last to give her some time to think, but she's not going to be least. I'm Christine Letts. I'm a lecturer here at the Kennedy School, and I also manage, to the extent that it's managed, the nonprofit policy and leadership program that we are developing at the school. My thanks, first of all, go to the students and my assistant who worked very hard to get this thing set up. Steve Etter and Terry Elniski were two of the primary students who worked on this, and then Jane Liu, who's our program coordinator for the nonprofit policy program, worked very hard to get everything ready. The format tonight will be that each panelist will have about 10 or 15 minutes to speak. And then I'd like to go back through and let each panelist respond to some of the comments of the others. We will have 20 or 30 minutes left for questions. We do have to end fairly promptly at 8:30. All of you are invited to a reception that is up in the Malkin Penthouse for those of you who aren't students here. It's just follow the crowd and keep walking up. We've got coffee and dessert for all of you souls who have made it here tonight. The nonprofit sector is finally getting the attention that it has deserved for years. I think as many of you have noticed, there are major new initiatives in several kinds of policy arenas that will affect the nonprofit sector depending on the outcomes of some of these policy initiatives. We have everything from Congress attempting to limit lobbying by nonprofits to the city of Hartford actually passing laws restricting or prohibiting the opening of new facilities to provide social services in their community. The media is continuing to sniff out the latest scandals and alert the public to the dark side of nonprofit behavior. The latest one was the New Era Foundation scam that there was great delight in reporting about. And finally, academia is getting in the picture. There's, over the last 5 years in particular, there's been a burgeoning of interest and initiatives at universities and colleges across the country. And of course, finally, Harvard has decided that there might be something of interest out there. I mean, Harvard's never one to jump on bizarre consumer trends, of course, but since there seems to be a lot of activity, both the business school, the Kennedy School, the Ed School, the Divinity School, certainly the School of Public Health, are all building building curriculum, building research in this area. Now, the nonprofit sector undoubtedly needs to play a role in the discourse about our public life and about the lives of our neighbors, particularly in regards to the future of our public institutions. As our public institutions are being questioned, different views have been turned to the nonprofit sector, and in some cases the nonprofit sector has been an example when people hold up public institutions as a problem. Sometimes they're held up as a public institution that is part of the answer to the problem. Some of the questions we want to talk about tonight is exactly what role the nonprofits are equipped to play in the discourse that is beginning to take place, and it actually needs to be shaped. Are nonprofits equipped to be leaders in this dialogue or followers? Or as another colleague put it, are they prepared to be pioneers or settlers? I asked our panelists to consider two questions tonight, and they may or they may not. But the two questions are, first, are nonprofits positioned to increase the rate at which we solve public problems or create public opportunities? So that question has to do with the capacity, and this capacity obviously can be demonstrated in different ways. The second question is, what kind of behavior in nonprofit organizations do current funding methods encourage, and what changes should or could be made? And that question begins to get to the sectoral forces and their impact on this capacity that is resident in nonprofits. Now, I'll introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present, which is right across to my left, and so they can just speak one right after another. Michael Lipsky is currently a program officer at the Ford Foundation, and he asked me to alert you that he is going to be speaking from his own position. He is not speaking as a representative of the Ford Foundation. He has spent most of his career as an academic. He's a professor of political science at MIT for 20 years, during which time he did a lot of consulting and obviously research on governments and nonprofit social service agencies. He's been studying nonprofits most of his career and has written extensively. He wrote two landmark books, one of which was one of the first books I read about nonprofits, which was a 1980 book called Street Level Bureaucracy. It's one that is held up and used throughout the world. And it was one of the first that really raised issues of the dilemmas of the individual in public services, and he raised questions about the transformation of people into clients by social service systems and by social service agencies. Most recently, in 1993, he wrote a book called Nonprofits for Hire, The Welfare State in the Age of Contracting. He co-authored that with Stephen Rathgeb-Smith, which examined the behaviors of nonprofits and the nature of contractual relationships between governments and nonprofits, and the impact of that relationship on their services and ability to deliver on their mission. One of the things that's extraordinary about Michael's work is that he has actually written whole books. For those of you who are students of the nonprofit sector, there are a lot of edited volumes that continue to come out, but in a lot of cases there isn't enough research going on for people to write whole books even yet. And he's one of the few that's done enough work and has had a major impact. Kevin Moriarty has been in government his whole career except for the last few months. He has finally leapt to the nonprofit sector. He is currently the CEO of the Methodist Healthcare Ministries, Inc., and it is quite a unique organization. It's a foundation that was created by the merger of to hospitals, as is increasingly happening, but it is a fairly unique kind of organization, and he will describe that. Prior to that, since 1975, he spent his career in the San Antonio, Texas city government. As he describes it, he's been running the welfare system in the city of San Antonio and essentially supporting most of the nonprofits for 20 years. Part of what he did in the last couple years, though, was engage in a couple innovative projects that he will talk about, for which he and the nonprofits with whom he worked won an Innovations Award. And he will talk about both the nature of the organizations and also how they came about. Ruth Mccambridge has been involved with nonprofits in one way or another all her life. She started a few of them. One of the ones that I know I've heard her talk about was she started a nonprofit for relatives of prison inmates and advocated in that role for prison inmates' families and prison inmates' rights. More recently, she was in charge of the homeless program for the Boston Foundation, and for the last several years has been head of the Management Consulting Services organization that was formed within the Boston Foundation to help build capacity in nonprofit organizations. And it was my and Michael Lipsky's knowledge of her work and her ability to speak quite eloquently that caused me to ask her to join us tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael Lipsky.
It's a pleasure to be with old friends, and it's a wonderful setting to share some ideas about something that's quite important to me. Thank you, Chris, for that very nice introduction. I will talk about some of the things you asked us to talk about. In particular, I'm going to discuss somewhat the question about the capacity of the sector to respond to important public problems. But before I do that, I want to take the opportunity afforded me by being the first speaker to do some scene setting or context making about this sector, because it seems to me that while there are probably a lot of people in the room who are part of the sector, we don't necessarily share an understanding of what we're talking about, and there may be people in the room who are curious about nonprofits and who want to get a perspective about why they're important. I think of the nonprofit sector as a soup-to-nuts phenomenon, one that encompasses the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Boy Scouts, and the March of Dimes, but also includes the most modest soup kitchens, the most rundown shelters, and social service agencies that do the day-to-day work of caring for people in this society. From prenatal clinics to home health services for the frail elderly, you could say that nonprofits provide services cradle to grave. Why are they important? There are many things you could say about that. You could talk about the extraordinary number of people who work in the sector. You can talk about the employment that they generate and so on, and nonprofit advocates do mention those things when it comes to defending their their favored tax status and so on. But I want to talk about or mention just three reasons why I think they're critical and deserve our attention. First of all, the nonprofit sector embodies, or is in a sense, the organizational expression of our altruistic impulses. If we are a people who care about the other, we can do that in many different ways. One is person to person, and that's important. But organizationally, it's the nonprofit sector that carries our altruistic opportunities and burdens. And that's something very important which government should respect and ought to be sensitive to when laws are made, tax reform is advocated, opportunities for contracting are available, and I have written about that, and I could talk about that at some other time. A second reason that nonprofits are important is that the word nonprofit, and particularly on the service side, stands for a sector that is representing people who are vulnerable and who need help. And to the extent that we can see and remember that the nonprofit sector is not just the people who work in it, but the people who are served by the sector, I think we'd be well advised. And thirdly, the nonprofit sector is, without question, a source of ideas and innovation for the society as at large. At least since the late 1950s, when the Ford Foundation pioneered the Gray Areas program that gave way to the poverty program, which was the flagship of the Great Society, if you will, the foundation world has been looked to identify problems early and to try to develop responses to those problems and to draw them to the attention of the larger society, which eventually means asking ourselves as collectivities, which means asking ourselves as governments to attend to these kinds of problems. I can just mention, if you look at the way the nonprofit sector has emerged, you can trace the new emerging social agenda just by looking at what nonprofits every 5 years care about. Runaway youth, shelters for battered women, food banks, hospices for people with AIDS. Whatever the emergent social problem is, nonprofits are there before government to try to be responsive. A third background question that I wanted to share with you is that the nonprofit sector is dependent upon government, particularly in the service field. The umbrella organization for the nonprofit sector, as many of you know, is called the independent sector. But it's really a misnomer. If it ever was independent, it's certainly not independent now. Quite aside from the regulatory umbrella under which nonprofits work, the nonprofit organizations, through contracting, are heavily dependent upon government money to do their work. Some organizations are actually no more than legal entities called nonprofit providers that do what government has created programs for. And those organizations are virtually entirely supported by government. Other nonprofit organizations, the more flexible and sometimes endowed social service agencies, are perhaps dependent upon government for 40 to 50 to 60% of their incomes. But they are heavily dependent upon government, and cutting them back represents a critical crisis for any organization that is part of this funding stream that is about to dry up. So government and the nonprofit sector are very much intermeshed. Nonprofits depend upon government, and government depends upon the nonprofit sector, because we don't have, as we may have had at one point, a capacity to implement social services. In very few fields are there government workers who will see the client. And the government is trying very hard to have non-government workers see the client. And that's what we call privatization through the nonprofit sector. And so government depends upon these nonprofit workers, these non-government workers, to do the work that it requires. Those are the background comments that I wanted to make. And I want to talk about the question of the capacity of the sector by briefly talking about what many of us know about the way in which new developments in Washington are influencing our thinking about the sector's capacity to respond. And this bears upon, by the way, the foundation's interest in these questions, because foundations also are dependent upon the nonprofit sector to do the work that it decides are its charitable requirements. So what is happening at the federal level? dare I try to summarize that in these hallowed halls? Let me say that there are three things I think that are happening very briefly, and I hope you'll forgive me if I oversimplify. A political consensus is emerging at the national level to bring expenditures into line with revenues by drastically reducing domestic discretionary spending. The second thing that's happening is that that there is a consensus to increase the state's discretion in the spending of federal funds that they do receive through the creating of block grants, the reducing of federal requirements, the waiving of federal requirements, and so on. And finally, there's an emerging consensus to abandon or significantly compromise the federal safety net of welfare entitlements and to transform income support for needy children into a series of parental work requirements or other demands on parents. That's what's happening in Washington, and it has an enormous, I think it has a very important implications for the sector and its ability to do what it has traditionally done with respect to service delivery and with respect to carrying social problems to authorities so that they can respond to them. And here are some of the implications that I think are involved here. The nonprofit sector will be significantly affected because advances in realizing the core purposes of the nonprofit sector, particularly in the service field, depends in large part on a robust public sector that funds public policies that are consistent with the purposes of the sector: anti-poverty programs, community development programs, education, reproductive health, and so on. Cuts in federal spending, accompanied by ongoing pressures to reduce taxes in the states, threaten the public policy infrastructure on which the nonprofit sector ultimately depends. And decentralization of authority for public programs and of regulatory responsibility changes the environment of public policy in several critical respects. The organization of policy interests, for example, is now largely Washington-based. Yet without substantial innovation, that infrastructure is unlikely to respond adequately to a public policy environment based largely on state decision-making. I hope we have a robust teaching program on state politics, by the way, not just on the nonprofit sector. Dependence on state revenues for a larger share of critical policy spending may lead state policymakers to reduce spending still further because of competition among the states to keep taxes low in order to attract business. This is the race to the bottom that many analysts fear, and that adds to the complexity of working in selected policy arenas when the policy environment is dampening public sector spending in the name or sometimes in the futile hope that it will get a leg up on business, on the acquisition of business and the creation of jobs. The capacity of states to deliver effective public services is at best uneven, and nonprofits may need to work with government to ensure capacity for public service planning and delivery. And then there's the question of cities and the exacerbation of inequalities that will be reproduced because American wealth is so unequally located city to city, town to town, and village to village. And so I think we are in a situation where our instinct is toward equity, and yet we're being influenced by a policy and an environment which is going to reproduce some of the inequalities that we've worked fairly hard to try to erase. For example, in the area of education and equity in education financing, the country has made some progress in making school systems more equal in terms of per pupil expenditures. That's going to go backwards as states steal from localities in order to continue the kinds of funding that they've been doing and reducing aid to localities as a result. Finally, I want to just mention briefly the need to think creatively about the opportunities that are available or that should be available in the thinking that we normally associate with centrist or conservative thinkers about the role of citizen initiatives, the voluntary sector, and how people can respond more effectively to community problems through voluntarism and through unleashing the power of people outside of government expenditures. One of my frustrations has been that we have been crediting people in the conservative side of the spectrum with interest in citizen initiative, interest in voluntarism, and so on. And yet, people on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, people who might consider themselves progressive-minded, have a long history of citizen participation, a long history that focuses on voluntarism and self-help, which has wrongly been ceded to the right and people who have an anti-government bias. I hope, Chris, that you'll find some of these remarks reflective of the question, reflective on the question of how we go about solving whether the sector is able to work effectively to solve the problem. My summary statement is that I think we have fallen into a situation where the sector is organized around Washington, around advocating changes in legislation, in a sense, in fixing the welfare state, making it better. And I think we now have to go back to communities and to other ways of thinking, and while continuing that kind of work, find new approaches to organizing the sector for the advancement of common goals.
Until an hour ago, I was the only person here, and I'm real glad that they made it. And this morning, I went out with my sneakers on, wandering around in the snow. So you wouldn't think that I came from Brooklyn, New York originally and spent 25 years there. A little about me. Probably the most compelling change that I ever went through was to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And probably the worst thing that ever happened to me was to watch the news this last week and 5 years ago and watch the country I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Liberia start to fall apart. So when I talk about the context of change and social change and public policy and social engineering, I do it in the context of a 20-year-old Peace Corps volunteer who remembers what the goals were and how highly energetic and motivated I was then. I still am now about the public policy agenda. I would start with you now to suggest to you that if you're interested in social change, you have to put yourself out there as that element of change in everything that you do and everywhere that you go. And if you do that, then at least you can say that you were the person out there working hard to get things done. For the last 20 years, and I'll get into the segue about my movement out of the public sector, but for the last 20 years, I was the director of the public welfare system in San Antonio, Texas. Now, we changed the name about 10 years ago. We called it Community Initiatives. We did that because human services and human resources and public welfare has a bad rap, and we felt that since over the years our target populations had changed tremendously from just welfare to many things related to welfare. I'm the child care provider, for example, for most everybody in San Antonio. We're the cultural center for the community, and we do adult learning and literacy for many people throughout the community. So we weren't really a typical welfare structure. We were a community structure of providing services. Around 80% of all the dollars that I received from one source or another, $71 million, was subcontracted to community organizations. So my structure, my staff, were the monitors, the evaluators, the fiscal control agents. In the public sense, the city put the bid out, put the proposal out, evaluated those, and decided which contractors to select, and then evaluated them at 3, 5, and 10 and 12-month periods, and did that analysis and brought it to the city council and the mayors and made the decisions. So they made the decisions based on our recommendations about who would be funded and how they would be funded. So what I say next, I assume a lot of responsibility for, but it is in the context of that, the role of government, the role of the city, the role of states in the monitoring and evaluation, the flow of federal dollars, which all have attached to them volumes and reams of rules and regulations none of which do I believe we're getting very far away from. I have to answer the question about nonprofit organizations being capable of changing the public policy or being involved in the public policy by saying no. They really are not, except for a few exceptions, and I'll talk about the few exceptions later on. What's happening in the nonprofit sector that I deal with, unfortunately, is that we pick contractors and we pick agencies to work with and to deal with because they're the best meaning, they have the highest motivation, they have the highest standard, they're trained as the social work and the social practice and the psychological practice individuals in our community, and they see the client first and second and third and fourth. And they're very client-oriented. And we then fund, as part of a government sector, a part of the need, a percentage of the total cost. We fund in the best program 20% of the total need in the community. So that nonprofit agency that takes a $500,000 grant to provide service for 500 clients has a waiting list of 2,000 clients, has a United Way funding source for part of their cost, has a foundation funding source, has 3 government contracts. And I read your books in the last 2 weeks, by the way, and you've said a lot of this, so you can read his books and read all of this as well. And it's true. And what happens is they spend most of their time doing the job they're funded to do and doing it very well for the clients that are in front of them and presenting themselves to them in a terrible way in need of services. And you say cradle to grave, and you can do that in an academic setting, and it's okay, but if you're sitting in an agency working with protective services or in an agency with battered women, in an agency with rape victims, in an agency with homeless, in an agency with all of these things, and you can go down and on and on and on, you kind of wonder how the folk can do that and still go home and still be rational, caring characters to their spouses and their family. So you've given them an enormously difficult job to do. You've funded 20% of it. They still have the 80% unfunded, and they're presenting themselves to them, and they're burning themselves out on the clients every day. So many of the agencies I deal with don't have the energy at the end of the day, or week, or month, or year, to go and get involved in public policy. In fact, many of them are not asking the question because they're just so completely overwhelmed by the problem. And in this context, we've begun the issue of devolvement. Okay, I like the word from the negative context. It begins with devil, and yeah, the devil may care. And this one, what happens now is that we move into an arena where we have carefully contrived service delivery systems that are designed, I believe, to keep the private sector, to keep the nonprofit sector out there working very, very energetically at the portion of the problem that they've defined as their target area, their interest area. And by doing that, there is no energy left at the end of the day to get involved in the public policy side. Now, some agencies are doing that, and national associations of local organizations are doing that, and there are public policy think tanks that are doing that. But the nonprofit agencies that are in the community that are working every day with clients generally are burned out. In fact, we've been sponsoring and paying for kind of retreats for our nonprofit agencies so they can take their staffs away for a half a day on a Friday or a Saturday and start telling themselves that they're really not these terrible people that a lot of the talk show hosts suggest that they are. To be in the human services arena these days in this country is almost to be in the public arena. I say almost because the worst arena you can be in is the public arena, right? But to be a social welfare worker, to be a nonprofit agency director, to be a social work staff person in a community is not a preferred occupation. It's not someplace where you're paid well. It's someplace that you do because you're highly motivated and interested and desirous of getting a good job done for a client. And you're not well valued. You don't get value from your clients. It's rare, in my experience, that clients come back and say thank you. But that's not why you're there. It's rare that government, at the end of a year of funding, says anything other than, well, compete for your next 1 year or 2 year grant. So at the end of this whole process of working your body to death, you have to put a competitively procured proposal together, and you have to go compete with your peers to see if you're going to be one of the 30 agencies, when there used to be 40, that are going to be refunded. That's what a declining domestic policy means on a local level. Well-meaning organizations that generally receive over 50 to 60% of their funding from governments are losing those types of funding right now. Non-profits are managing small portions of major community problems, and it's intendedly so. City councils and mayors are smart enough to know that if they're managing the problem, somebody's going to come in and say, raise your tax base. If they give it away to the local nonprofit organization, then they can say, well, it's their job to raise that additional fund. We're supporting it. Why? We're giving them $200,000 to solve this community problem. Again, remembering that the federal government's goal and the state government goals in all of these organizations and all these arenas is not to solve the problem, it's to manage it. And I think we've got this thing wrong when we suggest that any federal money out there is in fact solving a community problem. It's taking a piece of it for a targeted population, and it's taking a percent of it. It's taking 10% of the need, or 15% of the need. Head Start's 15 to 20% of the need. Aging services is 10% of the need. I mean, in all these areas, we're taking 10% of the total need. And my suggestion is that we have a wonderful system to manage the problems, not a very good system to solve the problems. So in the first question, there aren't too many doing public policy. The second question was, do the funding mechanisms, what could we do to change them? Well, I think the funding methods are patently unfair. I think when you force agencies that are doing a good job to compete with each other just because of the unit rate ceiling, it's unrealistic. When you look at outcomes-based on an annual basis, and you're talking about people changing their lives, okay? I mean, when you put somebody into a remedial education program and they're reading at a 5th grade or 4th grade level, and you want to get them to an 8th grade level, and you're going to measure that on a contract basis of 1 year, it's a little difficult to do. We're asking human services organizations to prove to you that you've changed the social structure of a community, and you're doing it on an annual basis. And you're evaluating it on an annual basis. I don't think that's very realistic. Yet that's part of the process of your federal regulations and state regulations. When things are unit rate driven, all that does is drive the unit rate down. Okay? I mean, you don't have to be an economist to figure that one out. You go out and you put the unit rate out there, and you're doing it for little money right now. You're getting paid poorly right now. You have too many clients. You have a waiting list, and you've got 10% of the problem that you're getting, and you're going to go to unit rate contracting. Okay, you can do 10 more people, and you can lower your unit rate. What happens to quality? What are driving these models? Okay. Nonprofits, rather than banding together, they compete with each other for the ever-spending dollars that are out there, and it's very difficult to do. Two models that I'd like to discuss that were successful at social policy changes, and I can only think of two in my own community. One was a group that was established in 1982 called the San Antonio Metropolitan Ministry. Now, all of you can figure out why San Antonio Metropolitan Ministries might be a powerful organization in the community. It was an ecumenical group made up of the largest churches in town with the most visible, verbal, powerful ministers running it. And they came together and they looked at their churches and they said, we've got all these homeless people in here and we're not having any government support, so we need to get some government support. So they banded together, put their groups of clients together, came to city councils and meetings and said, public policy needs to change. We need to, in fact, solve the homeless problem of San Antonio, and we're willing to be your partner city, but you've got to put some money out there. It happened at a time when San Antonio, which is famous for its Riverwalk and its tourism industry, said, you're absolutely right. We don't want people who are homeless on our streets. So a marriage was made between SAM, San Antonio Metropolitan Ministries, and the city of San Antonio, and we became their funding source for homeless assistance, and they became our operator. And it was a very successful marriage, and in fact, it's working very well. Their goals were to get the city policies to change, and their goals were to take their model of family reintegration, get families back into the community to work, and it's working fairly well. Though they very realistically understood that if they went after a high-risk population, it would be very difficult to do. So they went after families and families that needed to get back into the community. That one worked. The key elements were charisma, emotion. The groups had a fantastic personality. they had power, they had a sense of right, they had enormous energy, and they had anger. They had a lot of anger about what was happening to their constituency. So those elements in the San Antonio Metropolitan Ministry sense helped change city public policy. I don't think it helped change national or state public policy because they didn't want to act at that level. They wanted to stay local. The second group that was very successful was a group called the Cops and Metro Organization in San Antonio. And they're part of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which are a national non-profit organization based on the Lipsky method of trying to get social change occurring in the community. And they created what was called Project Quest in partnership with the city and the state and the federal government. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the partnership was a marriage made in heaven. I think the state of Texas realized that this was a very powerful community organization, and Ann Richards said, you can have $2 million. The city of San Antonio said, this is a very powerful organization, and you're right in our backyard. You can have $2 million. And the federal government said, well, you've applied for it, and you can have part of this Title III dislocated worker money for some organizations. And what happened with Project Quest was, out of a plant closing in San Antonio, 1,800 people were put on the street in a day. And they happened to all live in a community, one neighborhood, maybe 5 churches. And the infrastructure of employment and training programs didn't work. And they didn't work for a lot of reasons. They weren't really funded to work. They were funded to manage the problem. And the community figured that out at that point in time. The Title III program in the federal government provides $1,300 to $1,600 to remediate a person's training need. And we had clients who had less than a 4th grade education, were not English speaking, were 45 years old, making $18 an hour at this plant, and they were going to be trained for minimum wage jobs. So the community went in an uproar and said, this is unacceptable. The training program that was put together was based on an expenditure rate of $10,000 a person. Okay? So the federal government was saying, here's $1,300. That's what we give everybody nationally. That's the model. That's the formula. That's what we've got rolling here. The model that came out of this program was $10,000, and every one of the units said, we'll work together to make that happen. The outcome of that was a program that an MIT professor has just finished the study of, which has said that the payoff, the payback to the community has occurred in 18 months, and it's phenomenal. It should be modeled nationally. Now, it affected 650 individuals. The key discussion here is, will public policy change to recognize that in order to train people who have enormous remediation needs from an educational perspective, plus have to be trained into new marketplaces if we're willing to spend $10,000 a person to do that? I submit to you in the current federal climate that this wonderful model that is in fact an innovative one will probably get shelved someplace along the line. The last one that I'm working on, and that's kind of an interesting segue, 20 years in city government, 20 years as an administrator, and I have a department with $71 million and 700 staff people and all these contractors, and I jumped ship about 6 weeks ago. And I jumped ship to become CEO of a nonprofit organization. Now, why would somebody that's reasonably intelligent do that? I did it because the world that I'm working in is changing. The federal government is, in fact, contracting out lots of stuff. The environment of unit rate and unit-based contracting is going to, in fact, drive not just into the nonprofit sector, but into the proprietary sector, what the nonprofit sector has been doing for many years now. And if you don't recognize that, you need to look at your federal regulations, which basically has leveled the playing field, which is a very interesting way of talking about it. And what that has done is it has allowed the unit rates and competition to decide that whoever gives the best unit rate is in fact going to be the contractor to receive services. So in managed care, for example, proprietary hospitals and nonprofit hospitals are the same. You give a unit rate and you get the lowest unit rate, you can get the contract. And that's going to happen in a lot of other areas of services. I don't know that that's good, but I do know that that's what's going to happen. That's occurring. That's the change element out there. And one of my goals is to see if I can influence the public policy arena out there. I believe that the welfare reform and the managed care will in fact find a lot of clients who are no longer receiving services, and I want to be out there putting together the public policy piece that states who's not receiving services and what can we do about it for the future. Lastly, what I'd like to say to you is this. If you keep the public policy arena on your agenda, if you get out there and look at it and look at the causal relationships and understand that much of the state and federal policies are just designed to manage a piece of the problem, then you can start looking at designing new policies for different ways to get problems solved in our community. And I said this to a reporter once, and I'll say it here. I would be satisfied as a public welfare administrator if we decided to solve one problem. Okay? And I would be satisfied if we took child care, took Head Start. And rather than fund 45 programs which I administered, we fund one. And we just fund 100% of that program. 100%. Not 10%, not 20, not 15, 100%. And we took the resources from all the other programs and we funded this one program. Now, I realize that's very simplistic. Okay? And I realize it's probably not going to happen because of political constituencies. But I think if you look at what we do in public policy, from that context, why don't we fund 100% of one problem? We have the technology. We have the technology in every area to solve the problems facing us today. We have the knowledge. Okay? We have ample examples funded by Ford and Rockefeller and Lilly and Robert Johnson and Pew, and I've administered almost every single one of those programs and done the research in every single one of those programs. In fact, I have whole volumes of exemplary programs that are on my shelf that have not been put into public policy. And what I would suggest to you is that we don't have the will as a community, as a nation, as a society to take a problem and to solve it. We would, of course, elicit enormous discord in our community by not having the other 50 programs funded. And if that's what we want to put up with, that's what will occur. But what is occurring right now, I think, is madness. And I think what happens is, from a nonprofit sector, is it's driven to perform without looking at the public policy agendas, without getting involved in the public policy arena, without understanding that you're being funded to pay for a portion of the problem, to take care of a small piece of it. And if you took that and expanded what you do well to 100% of the eligible clients, then one by one, client by client, program by program, we could solve the problems and put our resources together. So you asked for a solution, said it's simplistic, it's very easy to do. Of course, there is no political will to do such a thing, and I know that, which is why I'm no longer in the public arena. Thank you. Bye.
They've heard what I had to say before, so that's good. Okay, I feel a little awkward because I feel like both of my co-panelists are cuter than me tonight because they had a chance to prepare. I did not. Okay, so they've been traveling and everything, but still, it's not fair. I want to, Kristen McCormick, who's sitting in the front row here, told me earlier that I had a tendency, told me earlier today that I had a tendency to be over-inspirational in some cases. And I don't care. I mean, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go way out there, and then you can pull it back if you like. But use those words. I just said you were way out there. Way out there. Yes, she did. She said I was way out there. I want to agree with Michael and say that my view of why nonprofits have the tax status that they have is because we give them that privileged status by virtue of their agreeing to embody our best intentions towards ourselves as a society. We see nonprofits as benefiting us, as being the way in which we become involved in benefiting ourselves, whether that be through religious, some religious activity or an artistic activity or a health-related activity or a community-building activity. That we see nonprofits as being the place where we can do good for ourselves and enrich our lives and ensure that some of our basic ethical beliefs are carried out. Beliefs like equity and rejoicing in this country's diversity and adequate education, all the other things that we continually talk about as what makes this country great, that we really invest the responsibility for that in large part in the nonprofit sector. Yeah, nonprofits. Now let me talk a little bit. I want to say something about kind of the way that I got into working in nonprofits, because I think it's important in terms of the way that I come at this point. I got involved in nonprofits when I was 13 years old, and I'm going to tell you this story because it's important to me. I grew up in a Jewish household, and there were a lot of people coming through all the time that were survivors of the Holocaust. And one of them left behind a picture book of what that looked like. And when I was 13, I saw a picture that came out of the civil rights movement in the South that to me was the same picture as what I had seen in that book. And what that said to me is that I had a responsibility to work my life long to make sure that that did not happen again. Do I believe that it's happened again? I believe it happens every day in various ways, that there is a deadening of society, and a deadening particularly of certain portions of society, a disinvestment in portions of society that's extremely dangerous in this country. So I'm just going to put that out there and say I have purely political beliefs that really guide the way that I work with nonprofits and the way that I think about nonprofits. My experience with nonprofit managers, the best of them is that they vary between wildly visionary and enthusiastic and idealistic and deeply depressed. And that, one thing comes out of, our view of the sky and the other thing out of our view of the government. And that we constantly, as nonprofit managers, are managing that as a reality. I do not believe that nonprofit managers are too tired after a day to go and try to affect public policy. I believe nonprofit managers, along with the rest of us, really are skeptical that we can truly affect nonprofit. It's a loss of faith in what we can actually do. Changes in and around nonprofits, as I experience them, and I work primarily with community-based nonprofits in the greater Boston area, are very dramatic and very fast. They're frightening. And they have forced us to resurface some questions that we have been ignoring for a long time. And these are questions around things like our mission orientation, our mission intentions. Are we really carrying them out? What does it mean if I'm a CAP agency and what I was organized around was eliminating poverty in the community, and what I see in my community is simply more poverty, more unemployment, more underemployment, a less adequate education, more disinvestment in this community. What does that mean to me? Does that mean that I'm doing the best I can in the circumstances, or does it mean something else? These are very serious questions for nonprofit managers at this point. And they're being pushed by the government's disinvestment or threat of disinvestment in those organizations. I can't say that I'm sorry about that. I see both opportunity and crisis in the current situation. I see that what's happening is, and let me talk a little bit for a moment, and I know I'm all over the map here, and you can tell me if I've gone so far off that you don't understand me anymore, but when I've watched, and having been involved in social change since the late 60s, what I've watched is I've watched the development of those CAP agencies, which gives you a sense of how elderly I am, and the eventual negotiating away of the ethics of those agencies. So those agencies which were originally designed around community empowerment, development of leadership, a broad leadership in low-income communities, and elimination of poverty and equity are now managing poverty. Okay, is this what we meant to do? No wonder we're depressed. This is not what we want to do with our lives. Okay, so that what happened over the years, as far as I can see and as far as I understand, is that what Washington and other funding sources began to provide in terms of funding for those agencies in a very seductive way was funding that was both very compartmentalized, and viewed people as collections of problems, and deficit-oriented, very problem-oriented, not strength-oriented. And so the things that had been so great about the settlement houses, which were really, designed as places where people would share both their strengths and work with each other around developing out of weakness, those things were lost. And for a good number of those organizations, what they found themselves in was acting as handmaidens of the government in managing and putting forth the image that the government was attempting to do something about problems that it was in no way, as Kevin said, prepared to do. So I think that compartmentalization has really kind of services has really, and of contracting as a funding mechanism, has really changed the way nonprofits have viewed themselves. The other thing that I think is interesting is that what happened is you have to think about this. If you compare this to a for-profit organization, if you look at a for-profit organization, say Camel Cigarettes, okay, and they understand people are getting mad about the way they market their goods. Or you look at someone else and they've had to recall, very fine fruit juice or whatever the hell it is, and they've had to recall 2 sets of fruit juices in the past 2 months. People will stop buying that fruit juice, okay, because they don't want an inadequate product. But in nonprofits, the customer is not the client, so-called client, is not the same as the buyer. And so you've got people who are receiving services who are not necessarily in constant communication with the government who's paying for and saying what those services should look like, or in a lot of cases in communication with the nonprofits themselves. That is a problem. Okay, because our discussions as nonprofit managers are with the source of our financial security, which is the funder. They are not with the customer, the constituent. That's my language for it. That, I think, has caused a real problem in terms of accountability. Are we really doing what our communities want us to do? Are we being effective in that? Who are we answering to? Who are we reporting to? Who are we saying, is what I'm doing right or wrong? Talk to me for a long time about that. The best most nonprofits do is the occasional survey or exit interview, which is non-dialogic. It is not a building progressive conversation. It is a single static conversation in a lot of cases. Now, the best of nonprofits are deeply involved with their constituents. Do I think they're capable of creating good public policy or affecting public policy? To my core, yes, I do believe they are, but not unless they begin to eradicate their own isolation from one another. And here, just getting into just a little bit of what I see as being kind of it's a non-political problem, really. Has to do with development issues. And it really has to do with it. Organizations, nonprofits, have grown up as individual entities. And after a while as individual entities, they begin to look to their own survival, and their interest is not just involved with the survival of their constituents or the best interests of their constituents, but also the best interests of their organization. And this divides up their intentions to such an extent in some cases that they really are functioning only at half capability. I think that in order for nonprofits to be truly effective in the next decade, that they have to do a lot of the things that the for-profit sector is doing. They have to become much more flexible, and their boundaries have to be a lot more permeable. People have to be able to collaborate with each other in much more trusting ways, to stop scheming on each other, to stop competing with each other. And funding sources need to support that, not by forcing them into false collaborations, but by understanding what it really takes for organizations to be able to do that. The second thing is organizations need to be in constant dialogue with their constituents. This is not a cheap proposition, I can tell you right now. And a lot of the reason why organizations are not is because funding is not available for it. So it's the organizing groups that really remain in kind of the constant dialogue with their constituents, because that's what they're paid to do. Direct service organizations very often are not in that kind of dialogue. And I think that the other thing that organizations need to be able to do is that they need to really look to what their larger intentions are. I have this dream in my head as the economy, the for-profit economy, begins to need less and less workers. And that's the reality. It's not that they need more skilled workers. They need less and less workers. What does that mean for our communities? Does that mean that we simply put up barbed wire fences around those communities? Does it mean we build more prisons? What does it mean? And in kind of my best dream, what it means is that we do more of embodying our best intentions towards ourselves, and we pay attention to things like the art around us, the things that make our life worthwhile, the music that makes us happy, the state of the environment, all those things that really enrich our lives and make them worthwhile, our creativity, our education, really using our education for things other than making a living. How are we likely to do that? We're likely to do that through the nonprofit sector, if it's in any shape to have that happen. And in my best dreams, I can see the nonprofits really being the vehicle of the future for employment in this country. But it would mean us reinvesting our faith in them and really understanding that they need to be more than what they have been. I don't think nonprofits are all good and the government's all bad. I think nonprofits have acted deplorably in a lot of situations that I've watched. I think that they have not kept their contract with their constituents for the most part, and that public policy in this country reflects that. I think we have a lot of work to do to build our capacity back up again, and that we have to be fairly unabashed about our discussion of basic ethics and what our real heartfelt intentions are for the people around us and for our own families and, for what we want the future of this country to be. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. We can all stand to have more people around that are over-inspiring, like Ruth. I promised you all a little response time, and I'm going to take it away. I want to open it for questions now, and I think that to the extent there are some more comments that the panelists have, they can kind of fill in, but I would like to take whatever questions there are first. Be prepared to speak into the microphone. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Deborah Gittin. I'm a master's degree student here at the Kennedy School, and thank you all for coming. And one thing, you've talked about the diversity of nonprofits, but we've still, no matter what the scale, we've been mostly talking about direct service organizations or umbrella organizations for direct service organizations, whether it's a storefront or whether it's the Boy Scouts of America. What are the responsibility of a nonprofit organization such as Harvard University or Blue Cross and Blue Shield that can be billions of dollars, enough to run a small state, that are getting that same tax abatement? How do they interrelate with these $100,000, $1 million community-based organizations? I often wonder how much of the anger that's focused on money that's spent on services really is misplaced when you look at the scale of those organizations. What should we demand of a Harvard or of a Blue Cross that they give to the community? Does it make sense for us to define the nonprofit sector as all of these things together? Sorry, there was about 12 questions. I'm sorry.
You're raising both a political question and an analytic question. The nonprofit designation hides a multitude of sins or sinners, if you will. I think it's an analytic liability that we think about these organizations as if their legal status told us enough about them to put them in the same analytic category. And I think there's important work to be done to... I don't really like analyzing organizations within the sector as non-profits, and I think we'd do much better to talk about universities, hospitals, service organizations, and so on. But that's not all that you're asking about. It doesn't make sense, I agree, analytically. There are the political implications of what you're saying, I think, have to be responded to kind of institution by institution. These organizations are not unaccountable, but in a sense they're privileged to be accountable through boards of directors who supposedly are representative of community interests and carry the purposes of the organization through their boards. But that doesn't mean that they are impervious to the society, no more than the Supreme Court is impervious to the society. Yet they are isolated, and intentionally isolated. They're not government, which is a more direct, it is more directly responsive, and presumably they're put in this place. But as Ruth implied, there can be abuse in that area, and there has to be a politics of Blue Cross, universities, and so on. And as we look at what's happening at Yale, what has happened at Harvard, just in the labor management field, we can see that there's an enormous amount of work to be done by people who are either very much in favor of what these institutions are doing or very concerned about some aspects of it.
I can't answer your question in the context of the university, but in the federal marketplace about 8-10 years ago, child care, for example, went from center-based, buy it from a nonprofit only, to voucher-based, give mom and dad the voucher, and they can buy that service anywhere they want, including a proprietary. And what I see occurring in the marketplace is that the distinction between nonprofit, for-profit has been and is being blurred based on choice, empowerment, vouchers, and these other models that are coming up. So I think there's a broader question you need to ask, and that is, if you're a charitable institution, you've got a charitable mission, a charitable purpose, it's in your guidelines, it's in your board structure, you're supposed to be carrying that out. That's one thing. But the other thing is that the way money is flowing, the whole federal movement and the state movement to vouchers and to these changes in systems and structures is in fact blurring the relationship between nonprofits and for-profits, and it's happening as we speak in the hospital arena, where there's hardly a charity hospital in this country that really does charity work, and if they don't become part of the proprietary system, they're just not going to make it in the marketplace, because in order to be successful in managed care, they've got to do things differently, and they've got to follow the for-profit model to be successful, because that's what's driving it from a public policy perspective. Those are larger questions, but what I'm saying is this whole arena is changing dramatically, and it's changing as we speak.
Let's go to the next question.
Yes, my name is Christy Baxter, and I'm in the MIT Department of Urban Studies. And my question is sort of a question and a comment. Most of what you've talked about has been the nonprofits as the providers of services that perhaps once might have been the province of government before government got out of that business. And defining it in that way sort of leads us to think about nonprofits as dependent on government, and that begins to shape a public policy debate around how much or how little government is supporting nonprofits. And it seems to me there's other stuff going on in the nonprofit sector, among the churches, among a host of different organizations that are not delivering services on behalf of the government, but are developing programs that in fact provide jobs, deal with poverty, deal with education, deal with child care, and other kinds of things. And that one of the potentials nonprofits have is to actually draw in the resources of private individuals, using the other face of the nonprofit, either from individuals or from institutions, which in fact are in control of most of the resources in our society. And so my question is, what about the opportunities for nonprofits to pull private resources in to solve our common problems?
You know, I'd like to answer that because I've always felt like the healthiest nonprofits are nonprofits that are dependent on a very diverse base of individual givers, because they have to be broadly responsive. And I think I did not mean to imply that all nonprofits or most nonprofits are dependent on government funding. In fact, most aren't. But the most individual giving in this country, it's interesting because I think that this links very directly to what I was talking about before, is to churches. And I think the reason why it goes to churches is because churches talk about the ethics of our everyday life, how we are to live our lives. They are our community. They are a place where we kind of pull together and try to understand, you know, how we are supposed to go about our day-to-day. And I think nonprofits miss the boat, frankly, by using very professional language and not relating to people on a very human level where they live. And when you look at who really brings in, you know, a lot of individual donations, they try to appeal to people where they live on some very basic ethical questions. I think the closer we get to those ethical questions, the more the community is going to be willing to give to nonprofits and support them. And I think it's much healthier to have the community do that directly than to do it through a tax structure.
Could I just add to that, that as this whole structure changes, I think nonprofit organizations that are doing a very good job and doing it very well for a funded population need to create a proprietary side. I mean, if you're doing counseling for abused children and you're doing it very well for abused children under a federal grant, why don't you do it for the general public at $50 an hour and subsidize the nonprofit side with that model? Why not take the flip side of the proprietary model, which is getting involved in the nonprofit side, and get involved in the proprietary side? There's nothing to say you can't have a bifurcated corporate structure to allow that to happen. In fact, that's what I have done in terms of my move. The for-profit hospital system, which the Methodist Healthcare System, Inc., nonprofit, owns half of, will be funding the operating side of indigent care to people who can't pay. I think it's very interesting. I think it's where the marketplace is going. And I think if we look at models like that, then we can become a little more creative in how we get these things resolved. The other thing I wanted to say was things change in this community, in this country, because it's good for business. Okay? So getting the business sector involved in this is very important. Out of the American Enterprise Institute Forum on the Workplace came the literacy effort, because workers were not skilled enough to handle high-tech jobs. Well, it didn't come out of the public policy of nonprofits. It certainly didn't come out of poverty reform. It came out of the business sector saying, we can't compete. So I think it's extremely important to get the business sector involved in the nonprofit side as a funder, as a partner. Maybe they should pay 100% of the cost instead of saying to government, you do it. Maybe we should change that dichotomy, that paradigm to some degree. I don't know. But certainly there has to be an interrelationship.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Neil Allison. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. As you may know, the Kennedy School is building a nonprofit policy and leadership program. As we've been talking about today, the nonprofit sector plays an extremely important role in providing public goods and handling community needs. And I was wondering if any one of you could comment on what you think some research aims could be for the growing program, what things aren't known about the nonprofit sector now that would really be useful to be researched and to be found out about.
I can talk from my point of view. I think what we do not yet know are things that are just now emerging. And I think that has to do with the involvement of people who are affected by programs being a part of decision-making and evaluation of nonprofit programs, that in order to make them truly responsive, that there have to be those mechanisms within organizations. How do you really turn turn over the management systems of organizations to allow that to happen. I think there are some organizations who have done that really successfully. And how does that get done? What are the mechanisms? To me, that's the most important emerging question. I think I think to a very great extent, this is a very unknown field in terms of its management structures, and that to a lot of, in a lot of cases, what we've done is we've tried to model structures after the for-profits, which in some cases has been wildly unsuccessful and inappropriate. And that we need to really look at what are really honest structures for nonprofits. How would they differ from for-profit organizations? Some would argue they shouldn't differ at all. But, should they differ, and how should they differ? And to what extent do we involve people in deciding what mechanisms they want to, to speak for them? Michael?
I'd like to see research on a question that Ruth raised earlier about the political potential of the sector. I think the sector carries with it, in a sense, it sounds a little too precious when I say the conscience in a certain area, but the sector has within it the knowledge and the committed people in so many of the service fields, but it is constrained to act politically for a lot of reasons, including a tension between that results from their dependence upon government as well. And I'm intrigued by, and I think it's important to look at the sector acting more explicitly and politically in the future within the constraints that it exists, but held back by no more than the actual constraints. I think there's a reluctance of the sector to think of itself as active in this area, and there's a lot of work to be done. There are many other areas that deserve exploring as well.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Eamon Rappaport. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask you all to elaborate a little bit on the idea that nonprofits maybe communicate or market themselves poorly. I think some of you noted that they may not communicate well among themselves, and volumes of good projects are sitting on desks and the wheel gets reinvented, or they don't communicate with their constituents and clients well enough. And some of the best examples I've seen of nonprofits communicating their message happens to be when they get aligned with maybe a corporate entity that has the resources and the money to put their name in an ad or run ads, and that may be in itself the main obstacle for a lot of nonprofits, is the simple resource of getting paid media. But I guess my question is twofold. One, what are the better ways we can utilize the channels for nonprofits to communicate their message to the wider community, and then what could their succinct message be?
Let me avoid that question in the following way. But it might be instructive. But all three of us, composing our notes independently, revealed that we are that we know about the power of social movements and the ways in which some of the work that we're talking about emerges from social movements, and in fact, in some ways is the organizational expression of social movements. What's so hard to appreciate, I think, at this point in time is how difficult it is to work outside of having the kind of base that supports, that greases the wheels or greases the skids, or whatever the metaphor is. In the absence of that, we see the nonprofits competing with one another, doing work that it's almost shameful for them to do, as Kevin was implying, and so on. And the question of marketing in an environment which is not politically mobilized to care about special education or all of the problems that, the social problems that we've talked about, makes it hard to want to get into a discussion about marketing this organization or that organization, when what we perhaps ought to be talking about is alliances between organizations and churches and community groups and political figures who recognize the power that some of these ideas hold, and creating an umbrella for the kind of work that you've been talking about doing that could protect this kind of development more broadly.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Peter Power. I'm currently at graduate school in School of Social Work at the University of Connecticut. And I just want to thank you for, you basically described to a T the situation in special needs adoption in Massachusetts right now, where you have a lot of innovative private agencies that are kind of forced into this product-based model. And so you see a lot of private agencies with some innovative ideas basically having to worry too much about the bottom line. And so I just wanted to thank you. But for some, I mean, you may be talking to a lot of leaders, future leaders here, and I did see the word leadership in the title of the forum, but it wasn't discussed much in terms of how do we invigorate that rather than all of us rushing to sell life insurance instead. What do we do to? Is it retreats? Is it weekend retreats? I should also point out that I've worked 9 years in special needs adoption in Massachusetts as an administrator, and yeah, you go home at night and you wonder if indeed I should be selling life insurance, if I'm going to be able to earn,
Well, that's because you don't know anyone who's selling life insurance.
Right. That's probably true. Yeah, I should probably talk to a couple of them. But speak to us about leadership in this field and how it can be invigorated, and because if you pay too much attention to the headlines in the newspapers about Washington, you're going to run the other direction.
I would love to say something about that. Of course, I want to say something about everything, but I believe, and I know this is going to sound, okay, maybe a little Pollyannish, precious, or whatever, but my experience in how do you promote leadership is that you look to promoting the leadership of the person next to you. And in the nonprofit sector, I think particularly that is true, because the people inside of these organizations are not well capitalized except by the people who inhabit them. The people who inhabit them have an enormous load of creativity, of motivation, of care, of interest and compassion. And when you fully utilize that, it automatically bolsters you as well. And I don't think we have such an individual view of what leadership is that I think that what it's done is it's really kept us back from moving forward as a whole sector and as individual organizations and as people. If I want to promote my own leadership, quite frankly, I will look to everyone around me to promote theirs, because that's what's going to do it for me. And I believe that that's true of organizations, that if they promote each other, they promote themselves. But I don't think we've quite got that yet. And it's a whole other politic about leadership development that it flies in the face of our individualistic view of these kinds of things in this country. Okay, I went way out there again, right, Kristen? But I could see you nodding at some point. But yeah, but I do believe it's a serious issue. I think when you look at the nonprofits in low-income communities in Boston, at the number of individual leaders in those nonprofits that you could point to and say this person's a leader, this person's a leader, it is pitiful. It is really pitiful, and it's not because they don't have the capacity.
I think of the question as asking, how do you sustain commitment? Leaders emerge. I'm not sure you can recruit them or identify them particularly well when they're just starting out, but leaders will emerge in every situation. How do you? The question is, I think, how do you sustain and support and encourage people to act on the impulses that they clearly have if they're in the sector? And I think that's done in a variety of ways, including appreciation in various forms, I think a program that validates nonprofit work, if it is based on the kind of commitments that we've been talking about, such as the program that Christine is involved with, is an important development. And there are many others. There are foundation programs to try to find people who are in these kinds of roles and recognize them and promote them within the sector and so on.
One last question. Rich, you get it.
My name is Rich Matthews, and I'm a mid-career student here from Asheville, North Carolina. And there are some of us in the nonprofit industry who are starting to have quite a few second thoughts and believe that we are, yes, aren't we all, contributing to the problem rather than helping solve the problem. And that through this industry's existence and growth is basically subsidizing the private sector and allowing it to pay wages that people cannot live on, and is also allowing the government to avoid considering a minimum wage or a minimum income. And I'm wondering if you think that we will ever get to the point anytime in my life where we can start to seriously examine the issue in that framework.
I don't know. There was a quote used by Marion Wright Edelman in her, I think it was 1986 Children's Defense Fund budget, and it was a quote attributed to President Eisenhower. And in his State of the Union address to Congress on his inauguration, he said, I believe, according to this quote, that the United States does not have to fear an enemy from without. It has to fear an enemy from within. And he defined that enemy at that point in time as poverty, as disenfranchisement, as an enemy, as not having a job, as not having the ability to be part of the systems in this country that will bring people forward. Well, that was prior to my time, and you're asking the same question now, today. I think, we all have to try and sustain that energy that we all have that allows us to continue to push that envelope at that edge to get out there in the issues of public policy. If you don't do it yourself, you can't let no one else will do it. If you're not out there saying something is wrong based on your feelings, your sense of what's right or wrong, and you abrogated that to somebody else, then you might as well just pick another career. If you're willing to do that and put yourself out and allow people who work for you to do the same thing and to take the most compelling issue to you and make it the most important issue of your structure, then you'll start having an impact on the social change model, because people will get tired of hearing you. Either that, or they'll buy you off, or they'll give you a program to run, or they'll try and figure out some way to get rid of you in some fashion. And I was very good at that. I made sure that the squeakiest wheel in my community got funding, okay? And if they were still squeaky, we gave them the public policy arena. We hired graduate students from every single school as interns so that we could energize our own staff, because they brought a questioning attitude to everything we did. And we tried to enable that and nurture that as well, and put up with it, too, because it was tough at times. So, you have to make those decisions yourself. And if you do, then it's your life, and you make those choices, and you go forward with it, and you're successful or not, and it's okay.
I want to answer that, too, though. I want to say I think it is unconscionable for us to work within programs that we do not really put to such a question test if they have to do with poverty. Because I feel like the evidence is unavoidable at this point in terms of how effective we are being. And that if we do not question ourselves to an excruciating degree about our past practice and what we intend in our future practice and how things are going to change and why and what we're going to do about them, then I don't think we should be in this business. That's my honest opinion. I feel like what we're looking at in the future is very scary. And we have a responsibility as people who set ourselves up as experts in such things as poverty, as if you could be that without being poor, and those kinds of things, that we need to be able to really be incredibly rigorous with ourselves in terms of being open to people challenging ourselves and constantly changing the paradigm to the extent that we can see where our fallacies are and where our analysis hasn't gone far enough.
One of the things that the Kennedy School has done quite remarkably is introduce the question of time into public policy analysis. And the implication of that is that things are not always going to be the way they are. They will get worse, and they will also get better. And I, just not to repeat what others have said, but I think I'm looking forward to working with the people who are in place and who have the experience and the commitment that so that when the tide turns, they are there. And that goes for people who work in lousy government, in situations in the public sector where they have been beaten down. I mean, I've been in North Carolina recently where legal services is at such a low ebb that you might ask the question, maybe you work in legal services, and you certainly have friends in legal services, and they are just doing work that makes them ask, should I really stay in this business? And maybe they should and maybe they shouldn't. But if they do stay in the service, then when people come to recognize the importance of that kind of work for the panoply of policies that we need to have in place, we'll call upon those people who have that kind of experience and that kind of commitment.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists. As I mentioned before, please join us up in the penthouse for dessert and coffee, and we can continue to talk about these issues. Thanks very much for your patience with our adaptive challenge tonight.
Hey. Good.